So what we're going to do now is add the functionality so that a user can click on this view button and display the activity in our details view over here. So when this view button is clicked, we effectively want to store the selected activity in our state and then pass this state down to our activity details component. So the question becomes then is, where do we actually store this state? Well, in the case if we were just selecting an activity to view and displaying our activity details component, then it would be fine to use our activity dashboard to store that particular state, because both our list and our details component are children of our activity dashboard. But if we think ahead a little bit, we've also got an edit button on our activity details, which means we need to pass the activity to our form. And we're also going to use this same form to create an activity. Now it's going to get a little bit complicated if we try and define the states for our selected activity in our activity dashboard. So what we'll do is we'll use our app component to store the selected activity. And that's also where we've defined our activities list, or we're bringing our activities in. So we'll be able to use those activities to then select one from there and store the selected activity in state. So let's see how this is going to work. So first of all, let's go to our app components. And we're using useState inside here, but we can use the useState hook as many times as we want. So let's add another piece of useState. And what we'll do is we'll say const selected activity, and then we'll add the function for set selected activity, and we'll set this equal to useState, and then we need to give this some initial states. Now this selected activity is going to be of type activity, of course, so we'll specify this inside our useState method. But what do we do about the initial state for this particular piece of states? If we leave this blank as it is now and we hover over our selected activity, the type that's been inferred is this is either going to be an I activity or it's going to be undefined. And it's been given this union type because we haven't actually given it an activity as our initial state. Now our selected activity, what we want this to be is either null or a selected activity. But if I try and use null as the initial state, then what we get is the argument of type null is not assignable to parameter of type iActivity. And because we've now put something in this parameter, our selected activity is no longer a union type. So what we need to do is we need to be explicit about our types here, and we need to make this a union type, and we can say that our selected activity can be a type of activity or it can be null, and this removes that particular error. Now when we select an activity, we want to be able to select the activity by its ID. So what we're going to need to do that is actually create a handler that takes an ID as a parameter, and then we can select the specified activity from our list of activities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const handle select activity, and this is going to take a parameter of the ID, which is a type of string. And inside our handle select activity, I'm going to say set selected activity. And then what I'll do is I'll take our activities list and pass this in here. And then what we want to use is the array filter method, so that we filter out every other activity apart from the activity that matches the ID that we pass in as a parameter. So I'm going to say activities.filter, and then we want to add the expression in to select the ID that matches the activity ID. And because the activities.filter method returns a new array, then we need to specify the index of the array that we want to assign to our selected activity. Now because we're filtering out everything but the ID that matches the ID as a parameter, we know that this is going to be the activity at index of 0 of the new array that we create from this activities filter method. So what we want to do now is pass down our handle select activity method all the way down to our activity list. And this means our activity dashboard is going to act as a kind of middleman for our handle select activity method, because we're going to need to pass it to our activity dashboard, and then we need to pass it down to our activities list. So let's do this. Let's go down to our activity dashboards in our app component, and we'll call it select activity, and this will be using the handle select activity method. Now our activity dashboard gives us an error because we haven't defined this function to be available in our props that we're passing down to our activity dashboard. So let's go to our activity dashboard next, and we'll add another element into our iProps interface, and it's called select activity. And then we need to pass in the signature of the function that we're passing down. So it's going to be a function that returns void, and the parameter that we're taking here is an ID, and the ID is of type string. And then we can destructure our select activity into our destructured props here. And then we can pass our select activity down to our activity list. And now our activity list tells us that we haven't defined the select activity as part of its props. So we'll do the same thing, and I'll just copy this select activity from the iProps here and then paste it inside my iProps for the activity list, and once again destructure the select activity. And then we can use this particular method on our button, and what we can do is we can use the button's onClick event handler, and then what we can do is pass in an arrow function and say select activity and pass in the activity.id. And I'll just reformat to make it a bit cleaner. And now when we click on this button, our selected activity is going to be passed into our state that's being stored in our app component. So what we also need to do is pass down our selected activity into our details component. So let's head back on up to our app components, and what we also need to pass down is our selected activity to our activity dashboard. So I'll just reformat this and then pass in selected activity equals selected activity, and then inside our activity dashboard I need to add this as a prop here, which is going to be of type iActivity, and then we can pass down our selected activity to our activities details component, and I'll say selected activity equals selected activity. And I also need to make selected activity available in my destructured props. And just reformat. So our activity details component is going to need an iProps interface as well, so that we can define the structure of the props we're passing down to this component. So back in the activity details, what we'll do is we'll create an interface called iProps, and we'll pass in our selected activity. In fact, what I'll do is I'm going to go back up to the activity dashboard, and instead of calling this selected activity, I'm just going to call it activity instead. And back in our activity details, I'm going to say activity is type of iActivity. And make sure this is brought in as well from our models activity file. And then we need to specify the type of component, and this is just a react.fc. And we need to pass in iProps as its type parameter, and then we can pass in the activity into its destructured props. And then what we can do is populate our activity properties inside our activity details component. So what we'll do is this image source, we'll make this an expression, and instead of using apostrophes we'll use backticks inside here. And what we're doing for the category images is nothing particularly clever, basically. I'm going to change the path from assets and category images / then the $, and then we're going to specify activity.category and then .jpg, because all of our category images inside our public folder, inside the assets, are located inside this category images, and they've just got names that match the name of the categories that we're accepting for our application. So nothing too clever going on here. It's just going to allow us to display an image based on the category selected of the activity. Then we need the activity title inside here, and the activity.dates, and the activity description. And what we'll probably find is that we've got an error. And if I take a look at my browser, I can see that the type of activity or null is not assignable to type activity. And this is coming from our app.tsx file. So let's go take a look at this. And if I go up to the app.tsx, then we can see the error that we're getting here. And what we're doing in this case is we're passing down an activity to our activity dashboard, but we don't know if this is going to be null or if it's going to be an activity at this stage. Now we're only going to pass down a selected activity to our activity details, or we're only going to display, more accurately, our activity details component if we've actually got a selected activity inside this piece of states. So what we need to do is tell TypeScript that we know what we're doing in this case, and it's perfectly fine for us to pass down this property to our activity dashboard. And what we can do is use an exclamation mark after our selected activity here, and this is basically going to define it as either an activity or null. So we're kind of overriding the type safety here. And this is fine in this particular circumstance, because what we're also going to do is inside our activity dashboard, we're only going to display the activity details if our selected activity is not equal to null. And the way that we can do this, we can add a conditional around our activity details component. And we can say selected activity, and then what we can use is the double ampersand, and what is to the right of the double ampersand is only executed if this is not equal to null. And we can reformat this to make it a bit tidier. Now, an alternative way that we can deal with this is if we remove our exclamation mark from here, we're going to go back to getting the error. But what we could do is define in our activity dashboard, we could say that our selected activity is going to be either an activity or it's going to be null. And this has the same effect as what we were doing before. And if I look at my app component, I can see that the error has now gone. And if I look at my browser, I can see that we don't have any errors and our application is working. And this is probably the more explicit way to do this. And inside our dashboard, this is more accurate in the fact the selected activity could either be a type of activity or it could be null. So that's the way we'll leave it in this particular case. So what we should find now is if we click on an activity and select it, we display the activity in our activity details component. And we can click and select different activities and they're showing up in our activity details component. So far so good. What we also want to do is only show our activity form is if we're either creating an activity or we're editing an activity. And if we're editing an activity, then we don't want to display the details component. We just want to show the form with the selected activity details. So let's take a look at that next.